Josh and Dr. Mark Durie with us as well. So we just say welcome on behalf of the SCAFI committee, who are mostly with us, few are overseas. And we've got a few missing tonight, I think, because they're probably all on Sky News watching Josh Frydenberg's Antisemitism broadcast tonight. And we're hoping we'll get a few more after 8 o'clock when it finishes, but we'll see. I know many have said to me they wanted to watch it live, and then they'll join us when they can, or they'll get the recording. So it's a privilege, as you know. All of us have been working and talking and sharing. I had David Southwick on Sunday, and happy to share the recording of that as well. Very, very passionate and very good supporter of the Jewish people and the Christian people. So it's with privilege tonight that I just reintroduce our founding Rabbi, Rabbi Isaac Riesenberg, to give a welcome to those that we haven't seen. So welcome, Rabbi, again, and pass to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. I must say, in all these years, this evening's session is extremely heartfelt. These have been difficult weeks and months for me personally, together with, I'm sure, most members of this community. I came to Australia as a child of Holocaust survivors, and the shadow of that Holocaust certainly was with me and present in our home. But truth be told, all these years that of my growing up in Sydney and in Melbourne, I cannot say that I've experienced any type of virulent anti-Semitism, particularly, as you know, I do look quite Jewish. With the exception of what has occurred in the aftermath of October the 7th, as I will share with you. As I'm sure all of you know, we have a great tradition on Pesach, on Passover, where we recount the story of the enslavement of the Jewish people, the hardship and the oppression of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and then speak of God's great, Hashem's great liberation of the Jewish people. But there is one verse in the story that we read from the book. It's called the Haggadah, and it addresses the issue of anti-Semitism, and it says, in every generation there will be those that rise up, that will seek to destroy the people, and the Holy One, blessed be he, will save them. And whenever my father said those words, I saw a pale come over his face, recalling those harrowing years of the Holocaust and the decimation of most of his family. Truth be told, I thought with the Holocaust I'd seen the end of virulent anti-Semitism. I thought that after the events of October the 7th, the world would see very clearly the evil of what Hamas is. I do not have to go what occurred. You've all seen it. And yet the reality is this event of October the 7th, after a few days or perhaps a week of grace, has produced an unprecedented level of anti-Semitism around the world, and even here in Melbourne and in Sydney, Australia, that we've not seen since the Holocaust. Personally, one of the most harrowing events for me was actually harking back to November 10th. On that morning, I gave a session on Kristallnacht, that night that when the Germans in 1938 destroyed the synagogues of Austria-Hungary to a Christian group. That very night in our synagogue in the Central Shul here in Melbourne, a Palestinian mob had gathered a few blocks up the road, and they began marching toward the parklands outside our synagogue, and in the middle of the service, we were advised to leave. I myself was ushered home very quickly as somebody said to me, "You look very Jewish and you don't want to attract too much attention." After that, in earshot of my own home, I heard some of the most obscenities of anti-Semitism that I've ever heard for the next 3 hours, well into the night. So I think this evening, it's a very timely conversation. I thank our very distinguished speakers, Mark and Josh, for joining us. And as John said, I do encourage everybody to watch the documentary, Josh Frydenberg's documentary. But I thank really all of you, particularly our Christian friends who have supported this program and who have come to support us in the city the other day. It's greatly appreciated that we know that this time we are not alone. Stephen.
Just before we pass to Stephen, I just wanted to say to all the Melbourne people, and we've got people, as some of you may know, from all around the country and from New Zealand. So from our Perth and to our Adelaide and up in Darwin and different areas around Australia, just welcome to you all. We're very privileged to have you with us. And what you witnessed in the first 15 or so minutes was some of the video of the Never Again Is Now in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, which some 5,000 to 7,000 people attended, which, according to the people that were there, was about 50-50 of our Jewish friends and our Christian friends standing together. And we'll talk a bit more about that and what's going to happen from that at the end of the program. So I'm going to pass across to Stephen Green, who is one of our hardest workers, does a lot of the mailing and the mailing lists, etc., from Olive Tree Travel. He's a great friend, and he's going to introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Rabbi. Shalom. Good evening, friends. Nice to see the faces and the names on the screen again. I have just been watching Sky, the first 30, 40 minutes or so of the documentary. If you're recording it, great. Otherwise, we know it'll be uploaded to YouTube, and there'll be opportunities for everyone to watch it and share the tears and learn from it as well, which it's really powerful and incredibly well put together. Josh interviews a whole gamut of people. David, I'm not sure if we'll show the snippet, the trailer
Yes.
between the speakers, so I won't say too much. John, I was one of the 5,000 to 7,000 people at the rally, the Never Again Is rally, and Never Again Is Now rally last Sunday. It honestly showed the best of and the worst of humanity, society, community. I don't know what to say. The emotional roller coaster that I was on that day, as many others that I shared it with, and that we've debriefed. The coming together of Jews and Christians and standing for love and togetherness, unity was incredible. The songs, the dancing, the words were really heartfelt and powerful. And yet just 100 meters away was, the most vile, violent, ugly scenes of hatred that was pretty despicable. And unfortunately, when you've got people that stand for different agendas coming to the same place, there's always going to be scuffles, and it's so sad to hear some of the incidents of assault, verbally, physically, that people that I know endured that day. the police did an unbelievable job on the whole of keeping the peace, of allowing the freedoms that this country affords us, and I commend them on that day wholeheartedly. And just finally to say, in the aftermath of the Never Again Is Now rallies and this quest of defeating anti-Semitism, we unfortunately woke to the news on Saturday morning of a vile act of graffiti on the walls of my kids' school at Mount Scopus College in Burwood. 2 words, that's all it took. Jew die. And it's spread around our community and on social media very quickly, and needing to talk to my kids about not being scared, and about the fact that it's happened. It's probably one person, and all these emotions and preparation to have the confronting discussions with your children. But again, I think in true resilience, the fence was painted pretty quickly, and not only whitewashed, but also put with the Israeli flag, the Australian flag, and the words that we live by: Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel live, and Chazak ve'ematz, which means strength and of courage. And that's really what our mantra is, and we want your mantra to be. And coming together tonight is very much strength and courage to all of us, to all of you. And we need to go, we need to be upstanding and stamp out the ugliness of hatred whenever it arises. So thank you. I know that our first speaker, Josh, has entered the room, and we've known Josh for a very long time in the Jewish community. He's the future, in many ways, of the next generation of leadership. Josh Feldman is a terrific freelance writer and journalist. He focuses primarily on Israeli and Jewish issues. His writings have appeared in leading American, Israeli, and Australian and other international publications, such as the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, the Age, the Daily Beast, Newsweek, and the Forward. I've read some of his works that have appeared in the Times of Israel and have been actually top-rated articles for weeks in a row, and that's not just according to his dad, who told me that. Josh has been to Israel many times. He's a graduate of that same school where my kids go, Mount Scopus, although he finished back in 2017. He won't mind me saying that in his most recent trip to Israel, he actually was doing some work behind the scenes for Elon Levy, who was the government spokesman who we often saw on TV. So, Josh, I will let you take it away. You've got the floor for about 20-25 minutes to just share with us.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the much more kind introduction than probably what I'm deserving of. It's great to be here. I wish we were here in nicer circumstances, but we deal with what we have. I'm going to talk about 2 things. One, some misperceptions that you have in the West about Israel and this war and how Israelis are viewing this war. And then I'll touch on anti-Semitism afterwards, because unfortunately that's a bit of a topical issue at the moment. So in order to understand Western gaps in the understanding of this war versus how Israelis perceive it, I want to start with geography. So earlier today, I went on Google Maps and I asked Google Maps, how long is the drive from Jerusalem to Nahal Oz? Nahal Oz is one of the Gaza border communities that was attacked by Hamas on October 7. And Google Maps told me it's a 101 kilometer drive. For context, from Google Maps tells me that from the MCG to Anglesey is a longer drive than that. Now, if we go up north, Jerusalem to Metula, which is on the Lebanese border, Google Maps says a 235-kilometer drive, which is essentially me driving from the MCG to Anglesey and back. Now, what does that mean? It means that, to put that into context, for the time that it takes the average Australian to drive to their beach holiday, an Israeli who lives in the center of the country where most Israelis live, they can drive for that same amount of time and end up in Gaza and Lebanon. So when we talk about Israelis feeling under threat, it's not because there's some foreign adversary, maybe, over in Beijing that is threatening Darwin or Perth. It's because they can see their neighbors and they can see the countries around them, and they really do feel under threat because it is literally right on their doorstep. And what that means is they view this war as existential. We hear this word existential, but what does that actually mean? Why is that the case? On October 7, Israelis got an insight into a world in which Israel didn't exist. Those 25 hours that the IDF was nowhere to be seen, that Hamas and other Gazan terrorists from other terrorist groups were roaming freely around the Western Negev, that was a world in which Israel didn't exist. And in fact, Gaza's territory actually tripled in size for that period of time. And what Israelis took from that was a very clear message that Hamas cannot continue to exist after this as a governing and a military force in Gaza. And to understand how much it's actually permeated Israeli society, I want to take something that Amir Tibon, who is the diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, which, as we know, is a very, very left-wing paper. He wrote this in November. He said, the bottom line is a country that doesn't retaliate in the most forceful way after terrorists kidnap an 8-year-old from her bed simply won't exist, especially not in the Middle East. And why did Israelis from across the left and right political spectrum come to that realization? Because they looked around at their neighbors, a 1-hour drive from them, a 2-hour drive for them, and they understood the simple reality that in the Middle East, if Israel leaves Hamas in power, the extremist forces in the region are no longer scared of Israel. Now, what happens if they're no longer scared of Israel? It means Hezbollah in Lebanon, which makes Hamas look like an amateur boy band, understands that if Israel doesn't have what it took to defeat Hamas, it won't be able to take on Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, if it decides to, will set Tel Aviv on fire. And as a side note, if we think what's happening in Gaza is horrific, and it is, the question has to be asked, what do people think is going to happen to Lebanon when Hezbollah starts bombing schools and hospitals in Tel Aviv? Because that's what it will do if, God forbid, Israel and Hezbollah go to an all-out war. And that's just in Lebanon. Iran with the Houthis in Yemen, their militias in Iraq. Israelis understand that they can only survive in the region if they have deterrence and if the Israeli public believes that Israel has deterrence. You can look at the alliances with the Gulf states. The Gulf states aren't buddies with Israel because they're Zionists, anything from it. They're buddies with Israel because they recognize that Israel is a strong country. And if you look at the conversations that Arab leaders are allegedly having with Israel behind the scenes, they all make it very clear that they want Hamas gone. They want Hamas out of the way. They just can't say it publicly. And so Israelis understand this, and they know that Zionism's fundamental promise is that Jews will be able to defend themselves. And those 25 hours, 18 hours that Hamas terrorists roamed freely around Israel's south, Zionism failed. And the state of Israel failed in its most basic promise to defend its citizens. And if it can't restore the sense among Israelis that it can defend them, and if it can't restore a sense of deterrence throughout the Middle East that you don't mess with Israel, Israel has no future in the region. It really is as simple as that, and Israelis understand that. It doesn't seem that that understanding has really permeated throughout the rest of the world. And that's why Israel needs to win the war. Now, what does winning the war mean? People sometimes say, oh, well, Israel can't destroy Hamas in its entirety. You can't destroy an idea. No serious people in Israel actually think that victory means killing every last single Hamas terrorist in Gaza, or that it means eradicating the idea of Hamas. What it means are two things. One, dismantling Hamas as a ruling force that it no longer has a capability to govern Gaza. And two, dismantling it as a military force with the ability to threaten Israel. Now, I'm not a military expert, but those goals are achievable. Whether Israel will achieve it is another question, but that's what victory means. It doesn't mean that every single person who ever had a nice thought about Hamas is going to be extinguished from Gaza. It's two very practical goals. Now, as for some Western misperceptions about this war, and we also, when we talk about these two goals of eradicating Hamas's military and governing capabilities, you often hear this commentary outside of Israel that this is Netanyahu's war, that this is Netanyahu's goal. The problem with that is if you look at every single poll in Israel, Israelis that have been taken since October 7, two things are very clear, and these are consistent. One, the Israeli public by and large is fed up with Netanyahu. But two, they support the war aims of destroying Hamas and freeing the hostages. And the reason is because this is not Netanyahu's war, and Israelis know that this is not Netanyahu's war. This is a war that's being run by a war cabinet, which has people in it who, to say the least, are not fans of Netanyahu, and it's run by an IDF, which is independent of him. And unlike, for example, in the United States, where the president can be viewed as the commander-in-chief, Israel doesn't work like that, where the prime minister calls all the shots in the army. So Israelis support the war. They're increasingly becoming more skeptical of it. And the question could be asked, is Netanyahu now trying to protract the war to stay in power? It's a fair question to ask now. But this idea that the war in Gaza is Netanyahu's war just totally ignores the domestic realities in Israel and the actual domestic discussions that Israelis are having about the war. And one of the things that this plays into is a discussion around the death toll in Gaza. So I did a quick Google. I found a Reuters article from May 25 that was republished in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And this is the quote from the article. More than 35,000 Palestinians have since been killed in the offensive, Gaza's health ministry says. What's Gaza's health ministry? It's not Victoria's Department of Health. Gaza's health ministry, just like every single government ministry in Gaza, is Hamas, just with the fancy title on it. And so news outlets that simply regurgitate Hamas's talking points are not reliable sources of information in this war. And they've had, unfortunately, a very detrimental effect on public opinion when it comes to how Israel's conducted this war. And what's another interesting point is that it says 30,000 Palestinians have been killed since the offensive. But it doesn't say how many of them have been fighters and how many of them have been civilians. And that's because we know that Hamas is open about the fact that when it gives its numbers, it doesn't distinguish between combatants and between civilians. So again, you see this blurring of a lot of people have been killed in Gaza, but the way that it's portrayed and often in the media is that it's just been 35,000 civilians. And so that has an enormous impact on public opinion. And one of the things that leads on to, as we've seen Penny Wong say time and time and again, is that the way Israel carries out its war in Gaza matters. Israel must do more to protect civilians. We've heard that countless times. And I want to be very clear, I am absolutely confident that Israel has made mistakes in Gaza in this war. The IDF is an army, and an army is run by human beings who are flawed at the best of times, never mind in the war. But what we're hearing is these vague Western demands that Israel needs to do more to protect civilians. And in my opinion, I think it says far more about anti-Semitic undercurrents obsessed with framing Jews as evildoers than they actually are with care for civilians in Gaza. And one of the big points that they often talk about in this is that Israel's response has been disproportionate. So let's break that down. Hamas says that 36,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since October 7. Now, I'm going to take Hamas at their word for this. And I hope that we can all agree that if we're taking Hamas at their word, we can also take Israel, which is a democracy, at its word with the numbers that it gives us. And so I couldn't find a more recent statistic, but the IDF says in February that 12,000 Hamas fighters have been killed in this war. So if we take Hamas's numbers and the IDF's numbers and we compare them, that leaves us with 12,000 Hamas fighters have been killed in this war, 25,000 Palestinian civilians, which gives us a combatant to civilian ratio of 1:2. Now that's horrible, and every single civilian death in a war is tragic. But in 2022, the United Nations said that civilians account for 9 out of 10 wartime casualties. So if in this war, and the truth is we may never know for sure, but if in this war, the combatant to civilian ratio of Gazans is 1:2, whereas the United Nations is saying that in most wars, it averages being 1 combatant for every 9 civilians, you could even make the case that Israel has prosecuted an exceptionally precise war that has done far more to look after civilians than what we have seen in any other war. But again, when the media pushes Hamas talking points, and you're sitting at home reading the paper or reading an article that says 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza, that nuanced message doesn't filter through. And we can see that now in Rafah. Rafah is Hamas's final stronghold. They say that there are around 4 Hamas battalions left there, which they say for numbers has swelled up to the equivalent of 8 battalions. And Hamas knows that it's its last stronghold, and it knows that it can't defeat the IDF. But what it can do is spin a propaganda machine into overdrive to get international pressure on Israel to end the war. And we've seen this in the last couple of days with this strike in Rafah, the horrible, horrible scenes coming out of that. And I want to pull a quote from the Washington Post, which is quite instructive of how the media has portrayed this and that impact that it has on Western opinion. So this was a direct quote from a Washington Post article yesterday. The makeshift camp was within Block 2371, an area that was designated a humanitarian safe zone by Israeli officials on May 22, according to Mohammed Abu Hani, a civil defense official in the Gaza Strip. And so this, for the Washington Post, is proof that Israel has carried out a strike in a humanitarian safe zone in Rafah. And they're quoting Mohammed Abu Hani, a civil defense official in the Gaza Strip. What's a civil defense official in the Gaza Strip? It's Hamas. And again, we can see how Western media is taking individuals that they know are Hamas and they're quoting them. And when you're sitting in your home reading that, that has enormous impacts on how you perceive the war and how you perceive the civilian suffering that is happening in the war. And I want to be clear, I don't know if other people saw the footage. I saw the footage from the strike in Rafah. It is horrific. It's really sickening. But when the media knowingly takes quotes from Hamas leaders, it has a detrimental impact on public opinion. It affects people's ability to actually understand what is happening. So the question is, why is this happening? Why are we seeing all this disinformation? I'm going to kind of brush over 2 reasons. And the first reason is that Gaza, at least on October 6th, was a sovereign state run by a mafia, and that mafia is Hamas. And we know how mafias work. Western media relies heavily on Palestinian journalists in Gaza for their reporting. And so what that means is that any Gazans living in Gaza, they know that if they cross the mafia of Hamas, they risk their lives and their families' lives. So any reporting that's coming out of Gaza that's heavily relying on Gazan journalists, that has to be taken with, to say the least, a grain of salt. And so the media, whether it's a Sydney Morning Herald or the Associated Press, they like to act as if it's the same as journalists reporting from the Canberra Press Gallery, but it's anything but that. And then there's, of course, the fact the education that the Gazans receive. And if we look at the polls, they made it very clear that between 70 to 80% of Gazans support what Hamas did on October 7. So when we see Western media relying on journalists in Gaza, we have to understand that this is the lens through which it's coming out of. This is the environment that media is being produced in Gaza, that news reports are being produced in Gaza that are then being disseminated in the Associated Press, in Reuters, in AFP, to essentially every news outlet in the world. And there's a second reason, which is perhaps a more malevolent reason, is that there's an anti-Semitic current in much of the West that views Jews as automatically suspect no matter what we do. And unfortunately, these kinds of people permeate legacy media. And as a result, legacy media frames the conflict in a certain way, whereby Palestinians are a passive party with no agency, and Israel is the aggressor that has all the power to end the conflict if only Israel decided to do so. And, as a thought experiment, how many pieces have we seen in The Age, in the Associated Press, and the Washington Post about extremist settlers, or an investigation into Israeli land grabs in the West Bank? I can think of countless. There was a very, very long one in the New York Times the other day about how extremist settlers have apparently taken over Israel. And how many articles have we seen in those same news outlets doing a deep dive into the extremist education that Palestinians receive in their schools in the West Bank and Gaza? I can't think of a single time that I've seen one in a major news outlet. And the reason is because much of legacy media isn't interested in confronting its readers with the truth about extremism in Palestinian society. And as a result, it's had detrimental effects on people's ability to actually understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because if you're not being shown the truths about how Israelis and Palestinians think, well, you can't really understand the conflict at all. And Matty Friedman, who is a wonderful Canadian Israeli writer, he now lives in Israel. He worked at the Associated Press for quite a while. If anybody wants to look him up, he wrote 2 really brilliant pieces on this in The Atlantic and The Tablet, which in my opinion are the best pieces that I've ever read on how the media distorts what is happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now onto the more fun topic of anti-Semitism since October 7. A lot of people are asking why. Why is this happening now? And I want to give two reasons. The first, which is the most disturbing, is that people were excited by the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. People were excited that Hamas killed 1,200 Jews. And we saw that because the protests against Israel started before Israel began retaliating against Gaza, before Israel's ground invasion began. There are protests throughout the world against Israel, saying F the Jews, where's the Jews at the Sydney Opera House, or gas the Jews. Before the war, before Israel initiated a significant response, people were excited that Hamas killed a lot of Jews. And I think we need to reckon with that reality. But there's a more complicated reality that I think often is very hard to understand, and that is that society is ill. Anti-Semitism is a bug of unhealthy societies. It's a feature of unhealthy societies. Healthy societies, on the other hand, repel anti-Semitism. Why is that the case? Because anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories can only function in healthy minds, and the same goes with unhealthy societies. An unhealthy society is a society that is ripe for conspiracy theories and makes it ripe for anti-Semitism. Paul Johnson, who's the late historian, he has a wonderful piece in Commentary from 2005. He called anti-Semitism a disease of the mind. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean when I say weak societies or strong societies? A strong society has strong political leadership, a shared sense of truth that we can unite around what the truth is, that conspiracy theories are on the fringe, and also belief and faith in the inherent goodness of our society, that we can say, I believe in the mission of Australia. I believe in American democracy, that America overall is a force of good in the world. And what we're seeing is that the opposite is slowly becoming the case. As we become more polarized, we have weaker leadership, conspiracy theories spread, and we're losing faith in our own democracy and in our own shared history. Society becomes a ripe target for anti-Semitism. And that is because it's not just another form of racism. It's a conspiracy theory. It's a mental illness. It's this worldview, as Dara Horn puts it, that Jews are collectively evil and don't deserve to exist. That Jews are behind all the world's ills. And that once you realize that all that matters is that I just need to get rid of the Jews. That's all that matters. It can't be solved with campaigns and education. And so what's amazing about anti-Semitism is that it's self-destructive to individuals and societies. If we just take two recent examples, if we look at Nazi Germany, when it became clear that they were losing the war against the Allies, what did they do? They were sending as many Jews as they possibly could to their deaths, at death camps, to Auschwitz, Treblinka. Because when the Nazis knew that they were losing the war, they were still focusing their priorities on killing the Jews, because it's a self-destructive mind. We can look at the same at the Palestinians today. The Palestinians, unfortunately, for nearly 100 years now, have prioritized pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to their own detriment. Because what anti-Semitism does is it allows people to blame their failures on others, i.e. the Jews. And when you blame your failures on others, you can't actually address the root causes for the ills in your society. So when Palestinians blame the reason they have a state on the Jews, that's great because it's a scapegoat. But they don't actually ask themselves as a national movement, could there perhaps be another reason why we don't have a state? Is there maybe something that we've done wrong? And so that's how anti-Semitism functions as a mental illness. And that's why there's a lot of talk about legislation. Josh Frydenberg's documentary on Sky News, I think, maybe possibly started 20 minutes ago or at 7:30. There's often this call for stronger legislation. But that's missing the point, because anti-Semitism isn't something that can be solved with stronger legislation or stronger police powers or clever campaigns. The solution to anti-Semitism is to create a healthy society. And that's a much, much more difficult task. I don't know if we're up to the task, but that's the only way to beat anti-Semitism, to build a strong, healthy, resilient society that can knock back these conspiracy theories. I don't know if I finished that on a positive note, but that's all from me. I do see there was, yes, Maddie Friedman, M-A-T-T-I. I will send the articles through in the chat now if people want to look that up. But yeah, that's me. It's not about education. It's about building a healthy society. And that's really the way to beat anti-Semitism.
Thanks, Josh. That was very good, and thank you for coming and sharing with us tonight. If people to get in touch with you, how do they do that too? That's always a good thing, to get your podcasts or whatever you're writing, etc. So you might want to put that in the chat as well. That'd be good for everybody.
Yes, I think Stephen and Rabbi Riesenberg have my email. So feel free to, if you want to get in touch with me, I'll drop my email. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. We might have time a bit later if you're available for a bit of Q&A, depending on how we go and time-wise, etc. But we just want to say thank you very much from us at SCAFI at the committee level for coming on and sharing tonight. Wonderful. I think, David, because we've talked a little about what's on TV against us tonight, which is always, I'll go to it after 9 o'clock and get the replay on Sky News of Josh's segment. But I think, David, you might have a little preview of what Josh is talking about tonight on the Sky News channel, if we can play that now.
Yeah, looking for it. Sound. I'll just start it back out here. Okay. Yeah, I've got to get back out to Zoom. That behind there. That behind there. This one here. Come up here. Okay. Yeah, they're right. Screen. Under here.
Press play.
Yeah, trying to get to it.
We've got a screen, but...
Yeah, I've got some things in the way. Oh, I can grab that. That's it.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Nice to be with you, Shari.
You were Australia's treasurer. You were prolific. You've basically disappeared from public life for the past 2 years. This tonight is your first major interview. What's prompted you to sit down with me today?
Well, like so many Australians, I've been really shocked by the speed and the scale in the rise of anti-Semitism after October the 7th. And I think many Australians don't know how bad and how dangerous the situation is today. So I wanted to use my voice to ring the alarm bell. I wanted to use my voice to shine a light on what is happening here in Australia today, and wanted Australians to see and hear for themselves what is happening in their own country with the rise of anti-Semitism, and to understand this is not just the Jewish community's fight, this is Australia's fight.
And so you've used your voice, you haven't just sat back and watched, you've used your voice to do something very powerful. It's a very powerful contribution to our nation. What have you done?
Well, we've put together a documentary where we've interviewed leaders from across the political spectrum, both past and present, business leaders, religious leaders, leaders from our arts community, and of course people who understand these issues from a security and intelligence perspective. We've also talked to Australians who have been directly impacted by anti-Semitism, people who have had their lives threatened, people who have lost their jobs, people who have seen their businesses close as a result of the intimidation, the hate and the violence directed towards them simply because they're Jewish.
Look, it's an incredible documentary. We're going to give our viewers tonight the very first look at Josh Frydenberg's new documentary. Here it is.
Did you believe, after surviving the Holocaust, that you would ever feel unsafe in Australia simply because you were Jewish?
Never. What's happening now, it's the same ideology, suddenly turning and becoming really hostile against Jews.
People need to be aware that this is happening.
One thing we must unite on is to completely repudiate any return of anti-Semitism. They were words of hate.
The philosophy of some level of extermination.
Surely, in modern Australia, we're better than that.
Just a little bit of anti-Semitism is okay. That thought has crept into the national psyche or into the psyche of some of our leaders.
People will have different views about Israel, about Palestine.
If you, as a Holocaust survivor, had the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister of Australia today.
Be aware of what's going on around you. Speak out for us. Lead.
What's your message to these Holocaust survivors?
That Australians stand with you, that we're honoured to have you as part of our Australian community.
Speak out on the right side of history.
That is so powerful, Josh. This is such an important cause to give your time and energy to do all those amazing interviews. We saw there you were in tears. This is very emotional. It's personal for you. It's not just politics. Can you tell me a bit about your family history and why this is so close to home for you?
Well, my family story is not unique. Like many Australian Jewish families, we've lost many relatives in the Holocaust.
Okay, wonderful. That's a bit of a preview of the show that's currently being shown on Sky, and you will be able to get it on YouTube after tonight as well to have a look at it. So thank you, David, and thank you for getting that little clip up, and encourage everybody to have a look at that when they have a chance. Tonight we have also the privilege of an old friend joining us, the Reverend Dr Mark Durie. And Mark, I met I don't know, 12, 15, 20 years ago. He was I think it was the Anglican Reverend at, was it St Mary's, Mark? Was that the church in Caulfield?
St Mary's Caulfield, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it was the only sort of Caulfield Anglican church. So he and his wife and family were there for many, many years, built a wonderful congregation, and were very much supportive of the whole Jewish community, and in fact hosted Celebrate Messiah for a while, as well as running their own services, which I remember quite well. And for those who haven't met Mark before, Mark is what I would call one of the wisest people or educationalists on the monotheistic religions and freedoms. And he also is one of the wonderful educationalists around Islam and what it's really about, and why have we seen around the world at the moment this rise of not just anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-this, that, and the other, the chants and all of that. What is the basis of this character of Islam that is, preaching and teaching the rise of killing the Jew and the Christian? And so I've invited Mark to come and share whatever is on his mind, and even to get a little political if he wants to, about the two-state solution, which is one of the things that is in controversy at this particular time. So I just welcome you, Mark, founder of the Institute of Spiritual Awareness. I haven't explored that with you, but if you want to talk about that as well, that'd be great. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Well, I'm really interested in how people understand faith and their awareness of religion. And we have a crisis in Western cultures of religious illiteracy and inability to understand how religions work. And Islam is a particular challenge in that respect. I'd like to just reflect with you why is Islam such an issue? And it clearly is an issue. In the UK, around 6% of the population are Muslims, but 75% of MI5's caseload is to do with Islamic terrorism. And they are tracking tens of thousands of people that the authorities consider to be potential risks for terrorism in the UK. And there would be similar imbalance in Australia as well, and everywhere in the West, in fact. And the key factor in all these places, of course, is Islam. But it's difficult to have an open, frank conversation about Islam. It's complicated. And it's partly complicated by our culture, because we have certain beliefs that have become wired into Western culture, which are just quite wrong and unhelpful. One is that all religions are the same, that religions are an expression of the human spirit. People are basically decent and good. So religions are basically all much the same. And that is such a bad idea. And it's certainly not true. They're very different. Religions create very different societies. Another view that's widespread in our culture is that religion is sort of meant to be private or personal. And it's shocking to people that Islam is a public religion, a political religion, and they don't know what to do with that. There's also a general denial about the power of faith in our culture. I think this is partly due to Marxism, which saw religion as an opiate, as a kind of way of dulling the senses of people. But the real source of evil was imbalance between different classes and economic inequality, and religion's just used as a tactic. But in fact, religion's not just a tactic, it's a power in and of itself. And there's also a denial in our culture, I think, about the power of faith. People are considered to be basically good, as I mentioned. There's also a view widespread in our culture that white, wealthy Western people are oppressors and Muslims are victims. A strong view that Muslims are the victims in the room. This has been a big problem in a number of jurisdictions where Muslims have done really bad things in the West, and the police have failed in addressing those issues because they were trained through sensitivity training to believe that Muslims are victims and not perpetrators. So these are aspects in our culture that make it hard to have a serious conversation about Islam. Islam's origin story is a violent one. Muhammad began his movement according to Islamic tradition in Mecca. He preached peace there, and then later Allah said to him through his Quran that a permission to fight is given to those who've been wronged, so defensive or retribution fighting. And then after that, limited aggressive fighting, and then finally unlimited aggression, fighting against disbelievers. And there's a whole theology around this in the Quran. There's a teaching that Islam are the best people and Muslims are the best people, and they've been raised up for humankind. They should determine what's right. They should forbid what's wrong. There's also statements that Islam should triumph over all religions. And Muhammad said in a saying that's well known, he said, "I've been ordered, that is by Allah, to fight against people until they testify that no one has the right to be worshipped but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So if they do all that, then they'll save their lives and property from me." So Muhammad said, "I've been sent to fight people," and the word fight in Arabic means kill, "until they become Muslims." Pope Benedict did mention that Islam was spread through force, and this received a very angry response from many Muslims around the world. I don't think they necessarily disagreed with his thesis, but they didn't like Islam being publicly criticized. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia responded, and he said, "No, it's not true that Islam was spread by force, because Muhammad gave people three options. They could become Muslims, they could surrender and pay tax to the Muslims, and they could keep their religion, or the third, another choice was to fight and be killed." So they didn't have to become Muslims. They could have stayed and surrendered and lived under Islamic rule. So it's an interesting defense of the idea that Islam was not spread through violence. Muhammad said to his followers, "Fight in the name of Allah, in the way of Allah. Fight against those who disbelieve in Allah," that is, who are not Muslims. Make a jihad. Invite your enemies the non-Muslims to three courses of action, which is to convert, to surrender and live under Islam, or they could fight and they could be killed or be killed. So these are sort of this world view of warfare as a means of spreading the religion or advancing Islam throughout the world is deeply hardwired into the fundamental texts of Islam. And Muslims today still regard as a great thing the conquest of the Middle East. These are not described as conquest, they're described as opening the lands to Islam. So it's held in, the idea of Islamic conquest is held in very high regard. It's never been, Islamic Arab colonialism has never been disavowed. It's never been apologized for or retreated from. I'm not talking about Islamic anti-Semitism in this talk so much, but I want to acknowledge that that is also, anti-Semitism is hardwired into the Quran and into the story of Muhammad as well. It is different in a number of respects from Western Christian anti-Semitism. Islamic anti-Semitism, I don't think, is essentially a conspiracy theory, but it's adopted elements of conspiracy thinking from Europe. It has its own characteristics, which I've written about elsewhere. Well, this idea of Islamic violence, which Muhammad taught and exemplified in his life, what does it lead to? What's the outcome? You know, when does it stop? Some people say Islam is peace, but if peace comes after victory, what does that look like? Well, the end game is, as Muhammad described and as the Grand Mufti described, is that people would become Muslims or surrender and agree to live under Islamic rule, or else the war continues. I want to make clear that this is what the canonical authorities of Islam teach, and they are still influential today. It's not necessarily what every Muslim believes. Lots of Muslims just want to get on with their lives and raise their families and settle into the culture and society in which they live. But these origins are deeply formative and still transformative for people today. Well, what about Israel? Which is facing an existential crisis. And the existential crisis, I believe, is ultimately driven by religion. That is the idea that Islam should rule. It's not that Hamas thinks there shouldn't be any Jews in Israel. It just believes that they should all be under the Islamic Sharia. I think the two-state solution is a great idea if you can assume that both sides want a win-win solution. But the Palestinian side has repeatedly rejected concrete opportunities for two-state solutions again and again and again. And Hamas's constitution, for example, expresses contempt for the whole idea of a two-state solution, and it rejects conferences that try to achieve that end as well. And I think particularly since October the 7th, many Israelis have concluded that the two-state solution is an illusion, it's a no-go, because basically the Palestinians have had lots of opportunities to advance that, and they've rejected, undermined, subverted, overthrown those opportunities. And I think Israelis are right to conclude that the two-state solution is a solution, no matter how morally preferable it might seem and how advisory it is for human flourishing. It's not going to fly with anything like that ideology that Hamas and even the ideological positions that followers of Fatah have expressed. So I'm really grieved about that, but I don't think a two-state solution is realistic. I wish it was possible, but it's not. I think the only reasonable option for Israel is victory and strength. It's very interesting. Recently, in February, in Lakemba Mosque in Sydney, a senior mainstream Sunni Muslim cleric declared that the only policy that Muslims should have towards non-Muslims is conquest and jihad, by which he made very clear it was military jihad. He spoke with pride about the great victories of Islamic history, and he said, none of them conquered the world by peaceful means, by negotiations, concessions, or understanding. So this man, Sheikh Abdul Salam Zoud, he has contempt for peace negotiations. He said they conquered the world, the Muslims conquered the world through jihad for the sake of Allah. And he said, basically, we Muslims today should do exactly that, and we should prepare all weapons and power that we have for this conflict. And he's quite explicit in naming non-Muslims. He speaks of Buddhists and Jews and Christians and Hindus and atheists. He says they're all against us. Do all Muslims think like this and believe like this? No, of course they don't. They're very diverse. And in fact, many Muslims have been victims of this ideology because there are factions within Islam, and this sort of hatred of the disbelievers or of the other is also applied Muslim to Muslims as well. So where you constantly have been, over the years, have had reports, for example, from Pakistan of Sunnis blowing up Shiite mosques and vice versa. Now, some say, isn't it possible to have an Islamic Reformation, just as there was a Christian Reformation? Now, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what a Reformation is. A Reformation is going back to the original sources of your faith to renew them. That was the idea in the medieval period of what Reformation was. It was a prestigious concept. And the Christian Reformation was an attempt to reform Christianity based on the Bible. It wasn't a progressive movement in the modern sense of progressiveness. And there is, in fact, been a reformation of Islam going on for decades, for a couple of centuries now. And the purpose of it is to restore Islam to its root sources. It's to make it more like Muhammad. And the problem with that is that includes the jihad package as well. So I think Walid Ali had said that once. He said, anyone who understands Islam knows that the Reformation's underway and that Al-Qaeda is the result of it. So it's also, there's a misunderstanding of religion behind that idea that all Islam needs is a Reformation, just like Christianity had. That implies that the Christian faith is sort of equivalent to the Islamic faith. There's no basic difference between them, and the same kind of historical processes would impact them in similar ways. But Islam is very different from Christianity and its foundations. Muhammad killed a lot of people. Jesus killed no one. And yeah, it's just so many differences between Christianity and Islam. It's difficult to talk about that in our culture where many people believe that all religions are the same. And that belief's very personal. If you believe all religions are the same, then you're sort of excused from attending to any religion. You have your own religion, it would be the same as well. So it lets people off the hook about spiritual matters. People say, let's have a healthy society, but how to do that if you don't have faith is a big question, an important question. And I think many people prefer not to have faith, and saying all religions are the same makes that much easier. But if religions are different and they teach different things and it could have an impact on culture, then might require some kind of choice, and people don't want to be confronted with choices like that. So many Muslims have been victims of this system. I thought I might just close with a reflection on the video of Israeli women that's recently been released, showing Hamas fighters speaking about making them pregnant. And this video is very, very, very disturbing. You see this large group of men taking women captive and actually stating what they're planning to do with them, which is to cause them to be the mothers of their children, I'd say, to raise good Muslim fighters for the future. One of the things that has shocked some people is, why haven't Muslim authorities denounced what happened on October the 7th? Why haven't they said, this is barbaric, we don't accept this? And even on the release of that video, why didn't the Imams Councils of Australia, there are two different councils of imams, why didn't they denounce this sort of activity? Why isn't there a clear voice coming, just a voice for compassion, for humanity? Why isn't that coming out? Why isn't there some sort of indication that people's lives have worth, or human dignity is important, that we are all, as it were, all people are of value, and there are certain types of acts that are repugnant and should be denounced? Well, I think there's several reasons why Muslims find it very hard to speak out against what images like the ones that that video showed. And it's important to understand the reasons why Muslims do not publicly, or even in their own private lives often, reject or criticize such acts. Firstly, one reason is that there's a deep conviction which is hardwired into Islam's theological base that Muslims are the victims. There was a conversation that an English convert, Marmaduke Pickthall, a convert to Islam, had in the 1920s, where someone challenged him about the Armenian genocide, which was a genocide of Christians by Muslims. More than 1 million were killed. And Marmaduke Pickthall was being challenged about Islam's record of violence. And he responded by saying, look, whenever Muslims have killed people, there's always been before that many more Muslims killed in the first instance. So no matter how bad the victimhood of non-Muslims is, Muslims are the greater victims. And that idea that Muslims are victims is hardwired into the origin story of Islam. If you read the Quran and study it carefully, you'll see that Islamic victimhood is the justification for violence against non-Muslims. It says that basically persecution of Muslims is worse than slaughter. That is, it's better to kill non-Muslims than for Muslims to be ill-affected. So there's a theological base there that's very deep and hardwired into, I'd say, the Islamic consciousness that Muslims are victims. This goes hand in hand with the Western left-wing view of Muslims being victim as well. There's a kind of reinforcement. There's another principle in Islam that it's wrong to speak ill of other Muslims. You should affirm the superiority of Islam in public and not do anything to cause people to speak ill of Islam. The Imams Council from time to time put out press releases in Australia, and they're often complaining about people stigmatizing Muslims in one way or another. They don't like it. It's interesting that they don't ever protest against, or they don't consistently in any way protest against Islamic terrorism, which of course stigmatizes Muslims, but they don't want infidels to speak badly of Islam. Another factor that silences Muslims is the concept of kufr, the idea that infidels are guilty rejectors of Islam and that they have enmity against Muslims. So Sheikh Abdul Salam Zud, in that sermon in Lakemba in February, he said, the Jews, the Christians, the Buddhists, the Sikh, the Hindu polytheists, and the atheists, all of them are against you, O Muslims. So he's totally convinced that if you're not a Muslim, you hate Muslims, you're against Muslims. The non-Muslims are enemies. It's a theological conviction, which can be proven from the Quran. It's actually the term for non-Muslims, kafir, is a very derogatory term. It implies deception, lying, and enmity. So to be a non-Muslim is to be it's a bad label. So that affects how Muslims see non-Muslim victims. They are potentially seen from a religious perspective as bad people. That's why a number of Muslim commentators said the Israelis have no right of self-defense. And you sort of have to think, what on earth does that mean? Well, it implies that the aggression against them was just and that they are themselves evil and culpable, and whatever happens to them is their fault. So this, again, fits in with this idea that Muslims are the victims. You can't give any credence to non-Muslim victimhood, or particularly not to Israeli or Jewish victimhood. Another issue in Islam is the rules of war. There's the Geneva Convention, but Islam has its own rules of war, which is what Hamas fights by, and all of the radical groups have fought by. There is this principle in Islam that unless there's a state of peace negotiated, the blood of a non-Muslim living not in an Islamic state is halal. That is, it's not a crime, it's not a capital offense to kill a non-Muslim who's in the house of war, who's living in a context which is not part of the Islamic state and not protected by Islam. To be protected as, say, a Christian or a Jew, you need to live under Islam and acknowledge its power over your life. Now, it comes out of the medieval construction of Islamic law, but it has a formative kind of effect on how people think, and it's a grid through which Muslim people sometimes look at the history of Islam and its bloody conquests, which they're proud of, because of this way of thinking about non-Muslims, that they don't have a right to life in those contexts. Another thing about those women in a very tragic situation is that in Islamic law, women captives can be used for sex. They are concubines of their owners, their masters, their slaves who are owned, and they're expected to be raising Muslim children. And this is part of the rules of war. It's understood. This is understood. Muhammad himself picked up a couple of Jewish women who were his partners and became part of his harem, basically. This is part of Islam. It's a matter of pride for some. So ISIS was very full of pride. It wrote about how it had restored the institution of slavery and restored the glory of Islam as well. Another factor that influences Muslims when they might speak out about to show compassion, to non-Muslims, is that they could be facing harsh consequences from other Muslims. This is a big issue in the Middle East. So there have been a number of assassinations of rulers and leading politicians in the Middle East who haven't been anti-Israel enough, or they've sought a peace with Israel. So Anwar Sadat of Egypt, he signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1978, won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, and in 1981 was killed by militants. The King Abdullah I of Jordan, assassinated by a radical advocate of the Palestinian state at a time when rumors were circulating that Jordan was exploring a peace with Israel. His grandson, who became king, and not long after him, was only saved in that attack because he wore a medal on his chest and the bullet hit the medal. So this young person who later became the king of Jordan almost lost his life in that same attack. And these sort of events have made political leaders, Muslim political leaders across the Middle East, very, very cagey. And this is, the Gulf. Some of the Gulf states want Israel to fight Hamas and get rid of it, because Hamas's ideology is to overthrow governments that are not following their strict version of Islam. But even though there are Arab regimes that want Israel to finish the job, they're not easily going to come out and say that publicly, because to do so would be like putting a bullseye on your chest or on your back. In the context of the Middle East, and the issue of assassination of leaders across the Middle East is very old. One's been going on for a very long time, and so all these reasons come together. Like, there are multiple reasons that are deeply hardwired into the culture of Islam, the theology of Islam, and they work together to cause this astounding silence in the face of evil. And this is shocking to Western people, because we assume that other people have a similar valuation of human life, and there's an assumption that people are all basically decent and good, and that all people would acknowledge the value of human life and find the sort of thing that's happened to those Israeli young women repugnant, and especially religious people should find that repugnant, because they stand for some sort of ethical system. And so we just cannot comprehend why these Muslim leaders don't repudiate or reject those sorts of events. But for all these reasons, they can't do it. They would be afraid if they did. They believe that the infidels deserve what they receive. They're inherently guilty. This is all within the rules of war, according to Islam. It's seen as beneficial to become the slave of a Muslim rather than to live in infidelity. There's this sense of Islamic victimhood which is very deep and very influential, and all these factors together help to explain how deeply polarizing October the 7th was, because you're sort of forced by that event to take a stance. And are you going to be for Islam, or are you going to be against it? And that's the choice that people face. And to be for Islam means to abandon the idea that you should treat the Israeli enemy as human and as deserving of compassion. There's a rejection of that, and this, I believe, is driving anti-Semitism in our broader society as well. It's a deep and ancient script that's being played out through the structures of our society today. I'm going to finish there.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to encourage everybody to go to Mark's website, which he's put in the chat, markdurie.com. He's got some great articles there blogs and probably does some podcasts as well. I'm not quite sure, but to understand what we're battling now. Before I let you go, Mark, you the founder of the Institute of Spiritual Awareness, I think it's called. Why do we see in Australia, we saw, again, for those who are in Melbourne, there were 5,000 to 7,000 at the Never Again is Now rally at the parliamentary steps. And then, 2 blocks away were probably 500 to 1,000, protesting Palestinians, for Palestinians, etc., etc., of which the observation is, no matter whether it's Melbourne, Sydney, or wherever there are protests on an ongoing basis, it seems like, there are some Muslim or Arabic people there, but there's a lot of white Australian protesters that have joined this movement, which absolutely baffles a number of us of how we tackle these protesters and this. How do we talk? What drives these people to join in such violent anti-Semitic protesting, in your opinion?
Well, these are partly the product of our school and university education system, which has emphasized the evils of colonialism, Western colonialism, and Western cultures. So they've been sold a lot of lies of different kinds, and their worldview has been corrupted by that. So not everyone ends up in the particular place. Not everyone ends up in that protest. There's some hundreds there, but lots of people have been shaped by a certain contempt for what we call Australian identity. For they're blind to the importance of things like freedom of speech and human equality. They are sincere. I think many of them are sincere haters, and they've been deeply shaped by lies which have been driving our education system and our universities. This is why the universities have been such poor and slow responders to deal with the protests on their own campuses as well. Yeah. So this is, I think we have some very deep problems in our culture that we've adopted an understanding of what it means to be human that's really destructive, and the purpose of human life that's destructive. I mean, I find myself as a Christian more and more alienated from the cultural context in which I live, and my view of the worth of a human being is so different from that's being played out in our culture. So yeah, I think we're in a deep moral crisis. I heard the previous speaker speak about that was Jason speak about need to have a healthy society, but to have a healthy society, you need individuals with healthy worldviews, healthy ethical, moral, and sometimes faith worldviews as well. And that's where we've been losing out. So I think the foundations of our stability in our culture and our health have been systematically chipped away at for decades. And the chickens are coming home to roost now. So anti-Semitism is the fruit of decades of destructive teaching. I mean, I've written about that elsewhere, and it's a whole talk in itself to kind of understand the crisis that we're in. And so, I mean, I'd say we're in a situation, say, where a sincere Christian, a sincere Jew, share so much in common in their understanding of human beings and the worldview, and what it means to be human, and what makes a good life, and in a way that's very, very different from a secular worldview, which is emptied of spiritual sense of spiritual worth and value. And that's a deep challenge for us. We will see many other problems in our society as well, not only anti-Semitism, and we see signs of this, loss of literacy in schools. We will see increasingly breakdown of the separation between politics and the rule of law. We'll see breakdown of the separation of powers in our culture. We're seeing that more and more. So yeah, we're living in a time which calls for bold and clear voices and strong and clear action. And that's why I'm so excited about Mark Leach's leadership of the Never Again Is Now movement. And this is a time to speak up. It's not a time to retreat into your shells and sort of wait things out and see what happens.
Yep. Yes. Thank you, Mark. Wonderful. And we're in agreement completely with you. Thank you, Josh, as well, for what you're doing, which is wonderful. So I just encourage people to get on and have a look at your websites and get in touch with you. I wanted just to finish with tonight, as Mark was saying, the leadership of Never Again Is Now. We all need to be on board with, and we all need to encourage. As most of you might know, next Sunday in Brisbane is another rally, and we encourage any of the Queenslanders who are up and around there to get to that rally in Brisbane. It's on the Never Again Is Now website. And the following weekend in Perth, for our Perth viewers and friends, there is again another opportunity to go and stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters and with our Christian brothers and sisters to say, we don't want this. This is un-Australian, and this is a real cancer in our society. So it's time to speak up. One of the things I got during the week was, as SCAFI, we've been forming some letters to send to politicians on a bulk basis, etc., about our point of view, how we represent over 300,000 to 400,000 Christians who do not wish to acknowledge a Palestinian state at this particular time, that we stand with Israel and for Israel. I think we sent out, I sent out about 63 letters to Labor politicians, and I got 3 replies. But what we need to do, and what the opposition have done very well over a number of years on the left now, is write individually to their members of parliament that represent their areas, because they're concerned about their votes. And we see this from the left side at this particular point of time. So we need to be writing individually to our local members, expressing our beliefs, our culture, our faith, our standing with our Jewish brothers and sisters, and saying we will not accept or vote for anybody who is coming from the opposite direction. So I just encourage you to get on board and write to your local members. Rabbi, do you want to say something before we finish?
I think certainly, John, they're extremely heart-warming words. I think Pastor Mark, a very sobering lecture, but I think what we can both agree on how to make a good society, if we hearken back to the 10 commandments. The first commandment is to acknowledge that there is but one God. The rabbis make the observation, you can read the commandments not only down but across, and polar opposite to that, the 6th commandment says, you shall not murder. If you believe in God, you do not murder a human being which is created in God's image. And I think that has got to be the fundamental principle of a good society. And yes, the challenge is great. The challenge is great, but we must not be daunted. We must continue to work together. And certainly John has given one very practical solution. So thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, Josh.
And thank you, everybody. Please unmute and give a round of applause to each other and to our guest speakers tonight as we close tonight's meeting.